Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for today's National Conferences of State Legislatures webinar, The Future of Distributed Solar Energy. Today we'll be discussing one of the hottest topics facing state policymakers. My name is Glenn Anderson, and I am the Energy Program Director for NCSL, and I'm joined by my colleague Jocelyn Durkay, who is an Energy Senior Policy Specialist. Today's webinar is the final installment of the NRI Committee's 2016 Spring Webinar Series. For a complete schedule and recordings of previous webinars for our 2016 series, please visit our website at www.ncsl.org. Today's webinar is going to be exploring some significant challenges that are being faced by legislators and energy commissions as they adapt to the rapid growth and rising demand for distributed solar energy. How can rising demand by consumers, businesses, and industries be met while managing system costs and technology limitations? What are the approaches that are available to policymakers to address some of these challenges? Well, to help provide a context and some updates in this area, as well as possible legislative and regulatory changes and solutions, we have three excellent speakers.
Hello, this is Jocelyn with NCSL. Before we introduce our speakers, I had a couple of quick logistics. Our webinar is being recorded, and registrants will be able to access a recording of the webinar on our website. It will be posted on the same webpage that you used to register for today's webinar, and we will also send a link around to attendees. Additionally, you can download slides from today's presentation along with several relevant reports right now by looking at the top of your the top right of your screen and clicking on the icon that's a yellow piece of paper with a blue bar graph on top of it. From there, you'll see our resource library with slides and the reports. Our format today will begin with brief opening remarks by each of our speakers, followed by a moderated discussion led by myself and Glenn. We welcome audience questions at any time, so please submit those throughout the presentation. You can enter your questions in the chat box, which is on the lower left-hand side of your screen. We're going to begin our webinar today with an audience poll, actually, so please take a second to vote on our first question. In approximately the last year, has your state taken an action on distributed solar energy? And your options are yes in the legislature, yes in the State Utility Commission, yes in both the legislature and the Utility Commission, or no. So thank you. I can see several attendees are entering in their information right now. All right. We'll give just one more second. Okay, so it looks as though we have a somewhat equal distribution between all of those categories. Between all four of them, it's approximately between 23 and 27%. So it looks like there's quite a range of activity that we're seeing in different arenas.
Thanks, Jocelyn. And so with that, we will welcome our presenters. We are fortunate to have three national experts with us today that have a wide range of expertise in either tracking these issues and exploring solutions to these challenges. So our speakers include Autumn Proudlove from the North Carolina Clean Energy Technology Center and Desire, Carl Linville from the Regulatory Assistance Project, and Commissioner Nancy Lang of the Minnesota Public Utility Commission. Our first speaker is Autumn Proudlove. Autumn has been with Desire and the North Carolina Clean Energy Technology Center since 2014. She manages the center's work on the Sunshot Solar Outreach Partnership, a U.S. Department of Energy program focused on solar education and technical assistance. She also works on the database of state incentives for renewables and energy efficiency, Desire. So welcome, Autumn.
Great, thank you, Glenn. So I'm going to provide some high-level context by talking about where different types of distributed solar policy changes are currently being considered. My organization puts together a quarterly report called the 50 States of Solar, where we detail all of the distributed solar policy and rate design changes that are being considered by states and utilities across the country. So specifically, we track action on net metering, value of solar or distributed generation valuation studies, community solar policy, residential fixed charge and minimum bill increases, charges that are applicable only to solar customers, third-party ownership, and utility-led rooftop solar programs. And we track both legislative and regulatory actions, but we do exclude bills that haven't passed the chamber yet, since there can, of course, be a lot of introduced legislation that really isn't going anywhere. So given that, you'll see here is our map of overall state action for Q1 2016, and this includes all of the topics that we track. So overall, we found that 38 states plus the District of Columbia took some type of action on distributed solar policy or rate design. And I'll break this out by each category that we track to provide some context for our discussion. So looking first at net metering, there were 22 states that had pending or enacted changes to net metering policies during Q1. And digging a little deeper here, this map shows what the major net metering change in each state related to. So we found that the most common type of action was making changes to compensation for real-time excess generation. So how all energy that is exported to the grid instantaneously is credited, as opposed to something called net excess generation, which would be essentially the credits you have left over at the end of the month that might roll over to the next month. So net metering traditionally credits real-time excess generation at retail rate because you're offsetting your production and consumption at a 1-to-1 ratio. But now we're seeing some states start to reconsider this, with Nevada and Hawaii being the first two to make changes. They both significantly reduced this rate. So in all, there were 9 states that considered changes related to compensation for real-time excess generation. And we also saw 11 states in DC take action to study the value of distributed generation, distributed solar, or the costs and benefits of net metering. And we also noted that since the beginning of 2015, 28 states have conducted a study or an investigation of this type. So we've actually seen a majority of states take steps to determine the value of solar in the past year or so. Looking now at some rate change updates, there were 26 utilities in 18 states that had pending or decided residential fixed charge increases. We found in the past quarter that the median requested increase was $4.84, or an increase of 55%. We also noted that there were 7 decisions made, and of these 7, 3 utilities were not granted any increase, 2 were granted their full requested increase, and 2 were granted an increase that was below their proposed amount. So the decisions recently have kind of been a bit all over the place. And now, we only saw 8 utilities in 5 states in the past quarter with pending or decided charges on solar customers. And so these would be either demand charges, standby charges, or some type of flat fee. And these requests have largely been concentrated in the Southwest today, as you can see on this map. And they've primarily been in the form of demand charges, which are based on a customer's maximum demand in kilowatts during the billing period. And since the beginning of 2015, no Public Utilities Commission has actually approved a mandatory demand charge on residential solar customers, so still a bit of unknown territory here. Now looking at some different solar ownership model policies, we saw that 7 states took action on community solar policy during Q1. which does not include changes that occurred to individual utility programs. It's just looking at statewide programs or policies. And I think in general there's been less action on this front than a lot of people have been predicting, but there remains a lot of interest in community solar across the board, so it'll be an interesting area to keep watching. We saw 6 states take action on third-party ownership during Q1. There's been a wide variety of actions on this front. We see Utah over here that expanded third-party PPA legality to residential customers of Rocky Mountain Power, the major utility in the state. And then on the other hand, we saw the North Carolina Utilities Commission issue a declaratory ruling that reaffirmed a local nonprofit solar PPA to a church in the state is in fact illegal. And in Florida alone, we've seen particularly a lot of internal division on this issue. And finally, the last topic that we track in our report, we found that only 3 states, all in the Southwest, took action on utility-led rooftop solar programs in Q1. So there's been a lot of talk about this as an option for utilities, but very few utilities so far have actually implemented these types of programs. So I know this is a lot of information all at once, but it gives you an idea of what kind of solar policy changes are actively being considered and where they're being considered. And you can download the full report in the media library for this webinar if you're interested in reading all of the wonky policy details. So with that, I'll turn it over to Carl now.
Thank you very much, Autumn. I think that was a very useful overview of the issues, and I wanted to remind our audience to please feel free to ask questions at any time by typing in your questions to the chat box on the lower left-hand side of the screen. I see we have some coming in already, so thank you. And as Autumn mentioned, our next speaker is Carl Linville. Carl Linville is a principal with the Regulatory Assistance Projects U.S. team. With his expertise in power sector markets, procurement, and planning, he leads RAP's work on renewable energy integration and transmission planning in the Western United States. Dr. Linville focuses on distributed generation valuation and tariffs, as well as regional reliability solutions. Please go ahead, Carl.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much. So why are we here? Well, people want solar. I pulled a poll question, a Gallup poll from last year, asking a broad spectrum of folks, do you think this country should put more emphasis or less emphasis, or about the same as it does now, on producing domestic energy from the following sources? And you can see that solar energy came out very high. So there's a lot of interest in solar. People appear to want solar in one way or another. The other major driver is that the cost of solar is declining. This graphic is pretty small, but basically what it shows is that the cost of solar energy from photovoltaics has declined steadily and is projected to continue to decline for the next couple of years. You can also see by looking at this graphic that there's a difference in the cost of solar, just the cost per watt, the installed cost per watt, based on the type of system. So a residential system is in the gold on the top. You can see that on a cost per kilowatt basis, that's a little bit higher. A commercial size system is in that bright blue color, and a utility or grid scale system that's a larger project, you can see in the green there. You can see part of the cost of solar is the cost of the solar cells. The rest of the costs, called the balance of system costs, make up that total cost number. The cost of the cells themselves, you can see in that brown line at the bottom. It's really become quite low. So why do people want solar? People want it for different reasons. Some people want it to secure price for over the years. So if there's a contracting opportunity offered through the utility, like net energy metering, that has stability going forward, they might see that as being a more stable option. Some people would like to help in reducing emissions, carbon emissions or other types of emissions from the electricity sector. Some people just think it's cool. They just like new technology and they want new stuff. Some people want to help work with their community, with other people in their community who are adopting solar on a community-wide basis. Some people are looking for more of a sense of independence. They like the idea of being able to produce their own power. Essentially, they like the idea of maybe being more resilient in the presence of outages and things like that. And some people, it's a simple economic issue. In some places in the country, rooftop solar is economically beneficial to those who adopt it. In other places, it's not. Customers actually lose money by adopting solar, but might do it for one of these other reasons. So what options do people have if they want, that first question teed up approval of solar, not approval of rooftop solar in particular, right? So what options do people have if they want to support the expansion of solar? They can invest in a rooftop system. In some places, they can invest in a shared system behind the meter where perhaps several customers or houses are behind a common meter and they go in together on a system and share the benefits. That requires, a different type of statutory setup. Some people, like the solar gardens and community solar systems, are typically in front of the meter, a shared system in front of the meter where basically customers can buy a share of a system in one way or another and be compensated for that. Sometimes they're compensated similarly to as if the system existed on their own rooftop, and sometimes there's a different compensation scheme. Or people might choose to support solar by just supporting the utility building more solar and making more of the portfolio of electricity that gets delivered to all the customers of that utility have a greater proportion of solar. So people's support, how they would like solar to be developed may differ. How do economics of systems vary? So there's been some recent discussion about this issue, so I just wanted to catch you up to speed. The least costly system to install and operate is a ground-mounted system, so something that's not on a rooftop, but that's mounted on the ground. It's typically a little bit larger system, and it typically has tracking capability, so it can follow the sun. So it produces more electricity per PV cell than one that does not track the sun. Ground-mounted shared systems that might be somewhat smaller, so you might have a grid scale or utility scale system that is 50 or 100 megawatts or even larger. A ground-mounted system that's, say, between 2 and 20 megawatts that's a community solar project may also have similarly low installation costs. There's some issues regarding to each, but it requires me to get into the details. And then rooftop systems are more expensive to install, as we saw in that first graphic comparing the cost of systems. But rooftop systems actually can provide some local benefits if well located. So comparing the systems in total requires you to look beyond installation costs alone. So what do different participants prefer? Well, utilities in most places in the country have traditionally made money by making investments on behalf of customers and ensuring reliable service and collecting revenues from customers through rate of return regulation. Most places, utilities prefer that continue, and therefore they prefer a system where they can retain ownership. And as was pointed out just recently, that doesn't necessarily mean only utility scale or grid scale systems. There may be systems where the utility owns, shared community systems, and people subscribe to that, or they may have some kind of arrangement with rooftop owners as well. So generally, utilities favor ownership. They favor it for a couple of reasons. It provides the stability of revenues and profits that their business model is built upon. It perhaps provides them more operational control, since reliability and safety is one of their mandates. They like that. They also like to retain customers and would prefer to supply their customers. What do people who want solar prefer? Well, it really depends. It depends on the value proposition presented. So, like, does net energy metering exist or something else? It depends on whether the customer wants to do other things behind their meter, like buy an electric vehicle and plug it in, or buy other distributed energy resources. It depends on whether they have a rooftop with a good solar resource. So rooftop solar is pretty much for single-family homes with a rooftop that is oriented in a way that it can harvest the sun. So people who have such a rooftop, are more likely to want it than others. And it depends on why they want solar. What do non-solar customers prefer? So we hear a lot of talk about quote-unquote cross-subsidy among customers. In order to actually determine a cross-subsidy, we'll talk about that in just a second, you need to actually do a valuation study. But generally, non-solar customers are fine as long as there's a net value proposition for them from a pure cost perspective. In addition, there are other customers who support policies to promote more solar. And so even if there isn't a net value proposition for them, they still may be supportive of solar programs being offered. One of the big questions is net energy metering fair? And being an economist, of course, I have to say it depends. It depends on the details of your situation, and you really need to do an independent valuation study to answer this question definitively. It also is worth noting that rate design really matters. Rate design, how electricity is priced, both for non-solar owners and solar owners, makes a difference in terms of what the compensation looks like for production, what the charges look like for consumption. So that goes a long way toward determining whether it's a fair deal or not for everyone concerned. The valuation study includes a list of avoided costs and utility system benefits. We can come back to this slide in the question and answer period because we want to make sure to leave plenty of time for questions. But basically, values include the energy avoided, so you don't have to produce electricity from other sources of generation. It may defer the need for new investments on the part of the utility in power lines, either locally or regionally. It definitely reduces system losses. Electricity is lost over the power lines as it travels miles along those power lines. So if it's produced locally and consumed locally, there's not electricity that's lost through heat. And there's some others, too, that we can loop back on if you're interested. It may also include some benefits that are consistent with state policy goals that, would not typically be included in a utility cost of service type of study unless, directed by some state statute policy. these usually called non-energy benefits, things such as economic development benefits, environmental benefits, things like that. So as I said, valuation matters, rate design matters, and again, very quickly, and again, we can come back and talk about this more, but basically we have three simple rate design principles that RAP, the organization I work for, thinks promote fairness. The first one is that the fixed charge piece should be relatively low. It should just include the costs of connecting directly to the system, what you see in that little yellow box there. Utilities prefer fixed costs that include the cost of the distribution system, those first set of poles and wires leading away to the substation. And the substation, some utilities even argue that the fixed charge should include more than that. Basically, there's the underlying principle here is competing resources from the grid versus resources locally, and what kind of a price signal do you want to send to customers locally in competition with resources coming from the grid. It's a somewhat technical point, but I'm happy to talk about it more in the question and answer period. The second principle is customers should pay for the grid in proportion to how much they use. So customers that have a big interconnection presence, like the house above, cost more to serve than customers that have a lot of shared facilities that serve them, so like the apartment below. So that makes a difference and should be accounted for. Customers also can have smart appliances. They can have air conditioners that respond when there's peak load. They can have electric vehicles with smart charging, where they're charging when there's low demand on the system and perhaps providing electricity when there's a high demand on the system. That kind of behavior on the part of customers helps the grid, and so customers should pay in proportion to whether they're putting stress on the system or relieving stress on the system. And customers delivering power should receive the full and fair value, and that has to do with that valuation study I talked about. So I believe that's my last slide. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'll pass it to Nancy.
All right, thank you so much, Carl. That was a very enlightening presentation, and I'm sure we'll dive more into many of those topics that you introduced with our next speaker, our final speaker today. And before we launch into that, I just want to also ask the audience to feel free to enter any of the questions you might have in the chat box on the left-hand side of your screen, and our presenters will be happy to answer those after their presentations. So our final speaker today is Commissioner Nancy Lang. Commissioner Lang currently serves as Vice Chair of the Minnesota Public Utilities Commission and was appointed to the Commission by Governor Mark Dayton in 2013. She also serves on several committees and associations, including the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, serving as co-vice chair of its Committee on Energy Resources and the Environment and its Committee on Washington Action. So let's welcome Nancy.
Thank you, Glenn, and thanks for the opportunity to be on the webinar today. First, I'll start out with just a disclaimer that, of course, today the views that I'm presenting are my individual views. They don't reflect necessarily the whole Commission's perspective. There are a number of active dockets still in front of the Commission, some of which I'll be touching on today, and so I will need to limit my remarks to what is contained in the public record. And then I do want to just point out for legislative staff and legislators that are on the call today, of course, utility commissions are not the creators of energy policy. That happens in state legislators. We implement the state energy policies that legislators pass and the governors sign. But it is important as legislators work to develop policies in some of these very new and evolving areas to be sure to work with your utility commission staff so that as you write legislation, you can understand what are some of the components of legislative policy that would make it easier to implement new areas of energy policy, particularly around solar, and what might be trouble spots that the legislature could define clearly so that commissions have clear direction in statute about how energy policy should be implemented. So with that introductory explanation, I'm going to launch into just some summarizing legislation that occurred in Minnesota over the last several years that has a direct relationship to solar energy. I'll just walk through these quickly and spend a little more time on some of these. In 2013, our Minnesota legislature required that Xcel Energy, our state's largest electric utility, implement a community solar garden program. They gave the opportunity for other utilities to file a community solar garden program, not required, but the opportunity to file one. And Minnesota Power, a smaller investor-owned utility, just recently filed and had a community solar garden approved by our commission. In 2013, the legislature required that the Minnesota Department of Commerce establish a value of solar tariff as an alternative to net metering. And I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in a few slides. A solar energy standard of 1.5% by 2020 was enacted. That is in addition to Minnesota's 25% by 2025 renewable energy standard that has mainly been met in the state of Minnesota with wind energy. This is an additional 1.5% coming from solar, with 10% of that energy directed to come from systems that are small, less than 20 kilowatts. There was updates to our net metering requirements that raised the net metering limit, which previously had been 40 kilowatts, up to a megawatt. So a customer of an investor-owned utility can now have a net metered system that goes up to a megawatt in size, but it also needs to be sized to load. So it can't be more than 120% of the customer's load. And that's kind of a safeguard against oversizing DG facilities. We had legislation in 2015. Municipal and cooperative utilities may charge additional fees now to recover fixed costs from small generators. And we are in the process of working through how those fixed costs are derived and how they're charged to cooperative and municipal customers. And the commission itself is going to be re-examining its interconnection standards. These are the standards that basically establish the rules of interconnection between a DG facility and a utility. Very important rules. They can impose costs on both the utilities and the customers, and so it's very important that those rules are updated and reflect electrical standards and good policy decisions. And we're doing that in concert with a larger grid modernization inquiry that is underway in Minnesota. And lastly, I'll just mention that Minnesota is a state that has vertically integrated electric utilities. They have monopoly service territories. They own the generation, they own the transmission, and they own the distribution. And so they own the entire system. And by statute in Minnesota, we do not allow third-party solar developers. In Amber's first speech that we heard about, she talked about some of the policies that are arising and decisions that are being made in other states regarding to third-party leasing and financing. But in Minnesota, there's a prohibition against third-party developers of solar. So I'm going to turn quickly to the Community Solar Garden program of Xcel Energy. And the reason I put this up is you can see that there's a docket number there, and that will allow you to get information about Xcel's Community Solar Garden. the legislature, I would say, put very broad definitions around what Excel's Community Solar Garden program needed to be. But many of the details around that program design were left to the Commission, and the Commission has spent an extraordinary amount of time, as have utilities and stakeholders, to set up a program that meets the statutory direction, that meets the terms as the Commission can interpret them to be in the public interest. Xcel Energy is implementing the program. There has been tremendous interest in the program, in part because of the rate that the Commission established, that customers will be paid, or credited, I guess is a better term, for the solar energy that is generated from their share of the solar garden. And so as you can see in this bar chart, the flow of work that is occurring and the number of applications that are being processed by Xcel Energy is very large. If you look kind of along the axis there, you can see towards the end the design and construction phase. Xcel Energy in their status application said that 317 megawatts are in that design and construction phase, which means interconnection agreements have been signed and funded. A third of the interconnection costs have been funded. That doesn't mean that all 317 megawatts in that design and construction phase are going to be necessarily built, because developers are talking about there are some delays occurring on their end with obtaining easements and executing leases and working with some of the siting issues. There are 545 megawatts in the engineering study process, which you'll see to the left of the design and construction phase. At present, only 2 gardens are now online in Xcel's service territory, but a lot are in the queue and a lot are working through the process of application, study, analysis, and design and construction. So if we look at the next slide, there is other solar garden development occurring in Minnesota. In fact, Minnesota Electric Cooperatives were the first in Minnesota to implement community solar gardens. Minnesota Power, as I mentioned, just had a community solar garden approved by the Commission. And what we are finding is that there are different models of community solar gardens. While Xcel's was statutorily directed to have certain requirements, other garden developers are working with different models. And in the case of Minnesota Power, customers are actually paying the incremental costs for solar generation. And what the benefit that derives to them is not necessarily an immediate bill credit, but rather rate stability over 25 years. And that's something that I know Carl mentioned as to one reason consumers are looking to solar. Another big solar policy that Minnesota developed is the value of solar tariff as an alternative to net metering. This was, again, a legislative directive to the Department of Commerce to develop a methodology that utilities could choose to adopt. It's not something that is imposed on them, but they can choose to adopt a value of solar tariff as a way to compensate net metered solar customers. And you can see that there's a separation of usage. You're still charged for all the electricity that you consume, but then you are credited for the production from your net metered facility. And this was resolved at the legislature with active utility participation, because utilities wanted to eliminate some of the concerns with what they maintain is a loss of revenue under a net metering system and perhaps cross-subsidization. And the next slide is basically legislative language, kind of the high points of the value of solar legislation. And you can see that the tariff is to contain not just the avoided energy, not just the avoided capacity, but also some of the losses that Carl spoke about, the transmission and distribution losses, and an environmental value. And there was some explicit definition of how the value of solar tariff would represent future revenue streams and for how long. And that methodology is available and online, both at the Department of Commerce and at the Commission. And there you can see a description of the value components within the value of solar and the various contribution that they make to the total tariff. Minnesota was the first state to adopt statewide net metering in 1983. We, despite that early adoption, don't have a lot of net metered solar. Right now, there's about 31 megawatts under the 40 kilowatt limit, which was our previous limit on net metering, and just about 6 megawatts over the 40 kilowatts. So as you can see, it's a pretty small part of our electricity sales. In part, I think that's due to the fact that we do not have third-party leasing and financing here in Minnesota. And then there's some description about how net metered customers' generation is treated with the rollover occurring if there's excess generation. And I know both Amber and Carl talked about that treatment of net metered customers. And lastly, I just want to touch very briefly on the role of rate design and why it matters for both distributed generation technologies and participating and non-participating customers. We as commissions, I think, are very well aware that rate design that we've had, what I kind of call the plain vanilla rate design, while it has worked well in the past because it's been simple to understand for customers, and I think has done a reasonably good job of recovering costs and assigning costs. We know that going forward, traditional flat rate design is probably no longer going to serve our customers or society best. And a little statement from RAP is that how we structure prices really does have a profound impact on choices that customers are making. And so lastly, I would just say that as commissioners, we think very closely about rate design. That really is one of our primary functions, is figuring out how to allocate revenues and costs. And so, the overall goal is that cost causers are paying for the costs that they cause. So we align rates with costs. Easy to say, not so easy to necessarily do and figure out exactly whose costs, who's benefiting, and that's a big job of state commissions and an evolving job, because rates, as I say, include customer, utility, and society values. We need more work on valuing rate components. The value of solar methodology that I talked about is a very good way to start thinking about solar, but there are many other distributed technologies that need to be valued, and NARUC is going to be releasing a manual on that this fall. And then lastly, we need rates that are accurate and easy to understand. If rate designs are there to change customer behavior through price signals, customers must be able to respond and understand how to respond if these designs are going to be effective. So that concludes my discussion, so thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. It sounds though Minnesota is addressing many of these concepts that our previous speakers have mentioned as well. So before we move to our facilitated discussion, we wanted to take a second to engage all of you all who are participants on this webinar, and we have another audience poll. If you would please take a second and share your thoughts on the following question. So what do you think is the most important consideration when discussing distributed solar energy policy? your options are providing solar energy at the least cost, offering diversity in ownership of solar, avoiding cost shifts, setting fair and appropriate rates, or updating the utility business model. And thank you very much. I can see a number of folks are submitting their answers. We'll give just a couple more seconds to see. All right. So we are, excellent. We're still getting responses. Right now, setting fair and appropriate rates is significantly ahead of all the other categories, has about twice as much as the next category, updating the utility business model. So thank you very much to our participants. We are now going to move to the facilitated discussion with all three of our speakers. Our first question is, why are many state legislatures and public utility commissions seeing challenges to the net metering approach that has become so common in many states? Is there someone who would like to take a first response to that?
I can jump in, Jocelyn. I think that net metering has worked relatively well so far, but it is a rough compensation mechanism. So I think there's an effort to become more granular and more accurately compensate both customers and utilities for the value that they're providing, especially now with more solar being added to the grid. If there are any cross-subsidies existing, then they're going to have a much greater impact. So it's important to make sure that everything is valued accurately.
I'll just jump in and add that I agree with what was said, that there's a concern that, you know, the net metering arrangement compensate appropriately the value of the solar energy and not result in cost shifts to customers who are not participating in solar energy. And I think it's important for state legislators to get some factual information about also the penetration levels that are occurring, because in many states, the penetration of solar DG is quite low, as you saw in Minnesota. And so there is a little bit of time and breathing room for states to gather information, to think about their approach, to think about, you know, what are your goals and policies that you want to encourage with net metering, and how do you preserve those goals and policies with something else? And so, you know, some states their backs are against the wall on this issue. Hawaii is the most notable state, but for many states there is time to explore this carefully and with some analytical rigor.
And I would just add that, you know, for a long time, net metering was implemented at a time when solar was really very much more expensive than it is today. And what's happened is that net energy metering has been very effective in helping the solar industry to take off. And there were a lot of costs being incurred early on, you know, building the supply chain infrastructure, getting the, you know, certification testing of solar installers so that people have confidence in them. All those kind of things of building a new industry, along with the high, you know, cost of solar, were really barriers that have had to be addressed. And the cost of solar finally came down to the point that relative to the retail price of electricity, it really started to take off. So I just say that I think a big reason why people are seeing challenges now is that penetration levels of solar in some places, not very many, but a few, are becoming high enough that people are really asking the question, you know, what is our portfolio of electricity generation going to look like in the future? How much of it is going to come from local generation? How much of it's going to come from big power plants located, you know, in remote places, as has happened in the past. And that future is really, it involves perhaps a different role for the utility, and also, really maybe involves a different infrastructure than was built to support these big remote power plants. So it's good that people are talking about this and about thinking about, what's the value and how do we align the value in a way that moves us toward the future that we want.
Thank you. And as was indicated by the poll and just the discussion here, that setting that fair and appropriate rate or compensation approach is really an important but challenging area. And with regards to valuing and compensating, what do you see as some examples of successful policies or practices? And just as an example of some of those that are going on, some PUCs, as was mentioned by Autumn, have approved higher fixed charges and are considering demand charges, while others have explored time of use rates or peak pricing. And so just was interested in hearing your thoughts on some of these policy solutions and what you felt are good approaches and options that lawmakers should be thinking about or considering.
Well, I'll put a plug in for RAP's Smart Rate Design Manual, and I don't know, Carl, if you want to pull out some key takeaways from that, but I think that does illustrate a lot of metrics that commissions and legislators ought to be thinking about.
Okay. So those three policies, those three principles that I had slides on at the very end of my presentation with the nice pictures from Hawaii on the side, those three slides kind of summarize the bottom line principles of setting fair rates that we support. So I talked about that a little bit, but generally, when these resources that happen on the customer side of the system, so whether it's solar generation or whether it's demand response, like people have air conditioners that get shut off so many times a year to help reduce demand on the system during high cost times, things like that. It's important that there be a price signal that the customers see that reflects the value of that resource. Because at the end of the day, what we all want is we want safe, reliable, affordable service. We want it to come from resources both on the grid side of the system, the big power plants, as well as from customers. And so one of the issues that comes up in rate design is when you put a lot of the cost of electricity into a fixed charge, you really mute the price signal that customers see. So if you have a rather large, so we consider a fixed charge that recovers, is appropriate, is more in the $4 to $8 a month range for a residential customer. Once you get more than that, what happens is that you're recovering the revenues from customers without sending a price signal, and so you don't give people as strong an incentive to conserve electricity or to choose to produce electricity if they want to do that. The concern that utilities have is, and that we should all have, is the revenue that we're receiving adequate to pay for the grid? Maybe someday we'll have a lot of people going off the grid, but that's going to be a long way off. So we're going to need the grid that the utility is operating for a long time. And we want the utility to be adequately compensated for the costs and the services that they provide. It's less risky for them if it comes back to them in the way of a fixed charge. But we would argue that there are other ways to ensure revenue adequacy, that you can get revenue adequacy for your utility and maintain the price signal to customers that encourages appropriate investment in solar customer resources like energy efficiency and so forth. So the three principles that I enunciated that are reflected in that smart rate design paper, basically follow that thinking.
Great. So we're going to take a few audience questions, and our first one, before we can have another question posed by Jocelyn, but the first audience question we want to just pose in general. I guess Autumn may have some good background here, but then the others might as well. How are you seeing net energy metering caps change in different states, and are many states reaching those caps? Which states are those, and what type of changes are being made to those caps?
Yeah, I'll jump in. Not every state has a net metering cap, but many of them do, and many of them are also reaching them. And we're seeing two really major approaches to this. We're seeing some states that are reaching the caps, and then they're really just increasing them and keeping their net metering policies relatively the same. And then we're seeing other states that are reaching these caps and going the net metering 2.0 route, where they're looking at it more comprehensively and making much larger changes to the policy as a whole, and then removing the cap altogether. So in Massachusetts and New Hampshire, we recently saw them reach caps and increase them. We also see Vermont and Louisiana reaching their caps, and they're looking at some more major changes, I think, to the way solar energy is credited. So I see those two main pathways, but it's varying from state to state, of course.
Thank you very much. And with that, we're going to move to a third facilitated discussion question. And Commissioner Lang, if we could have you maybe begin with this. Since many net metering programs are initiated through legislative action, what role do you see for legislatures in this arena?
Well, certainly legislators, as you say, have a large say in many states in terms of the net metering parameters, the size of the program. And so obviously monitoring how that's going, understanding the costs and benefits of the program, understanding the context of distributed technologies in the larger footprint of energy technologies. The point that Carl was making about, how do we think about distributed solar as an energy resource? How valuable is that to our state alongside some of the more, traditional generating resources? Those are all the kinds of questions that legislators should be asking themselves as they evaluate net metering. And I think, one of the things that many states, as I said, are not at the level of net metering causing large cost shifts or rate impacts or system impacts yet. And so my advice would be proactive on this. Understand where you're presently at, understand how those net metering statutes fit within your overall energy policy, and figure out where you want to head and start making some incremental changes to your policy if you feel that's needed. But be proactive about it, and I think that's some good advice for state commissions as well.
Great. So we do have, we're going to take another audience question. I also wanted to remind folks that we actually do have that RAF report that has been discussed and mentioned a few times during the presentations. posted in the media library, and that is the little, there's a document with a little chart or graph right over it in the upper right-hand side of your screen that you'll see, and you can access that report there. So the next question we wanted to ask actually came directly out of Washington, and I guess that this would be for Autumn, regarding the slide of 2016 PUC actions, which showed that Washington State had an action on distributed solar. This person, I believe, is from Washington, but was not aware of that action. Do you know what that was?
So that action last quarter was a proposed increase in the residential fixed charge, and that was Avista Utilities. They actually had one decision made and were not granted their increase, and then proposed a new increase that was lower. So that's not really solar specific, but it definitely impacts the economics of solar. So we include it in our report.
Great, and then we'll do one more audience question here, and this one is regarding some of the states that definitely are hitting higher percentages of solar on their grid and rolling back some of the compensation values. Massachusetts has done this. Hawaii has stopped net metering in some cases, or actually in general, as they are considering some activities there. And I think there's big discussions, obviously, in California and some other states. Can you clarify the motive behind some of maybe these rollbacks and changes, and what that intended impact is, and what the results might be? And this is something that is going to be seen, I guess, in the future, what kind of trends we might see with regards to this discussion in the future. And that can be generally to anyone, sure.
Okay, well, I'll start and try to stay brief. But, so, the net energy metering, like I believe Amber said early on, is a rough justice approach. It was intended as originally designed to help launch the industry. There were not detailed valuation studies done in support of net metering up until quite recently. So I think states are recognizing that maybe they want to ask that question. Is this rough policy the right one? Is it fair to everyone? Is it taking us in the direction that we want to go, and so forth? Net energy metering has led to a lot of growth in customer-sided solar, and this is challenging to utilities who are seeing less opportunity for revenues from the generation of power going forward. They're seeing that they may need to be compensated in a different way if they're not going to be building as much physical capital. Then maybe they need to be compensated in other ways, and people are talking about other ways of compensating utilities to ensure that revenue adequacy. So that's a good topic for discussion as well. And people are thinking the other thing is that when you get to the higher penetration level, you're sometimes get to a point where you need to invest in different infrastructure than you would have in the previous time. So in the previous time, if you had needs or issues arising on the grid, it often involved upgrading the transmission system, the big power lines, or building a new power plant. Now it might mean upgrading your local transformers or substations, expenditures on the distribution side. So, and thinking through, what are the right places to be spending money is all a part of thinking about how we want, how fast we want solar to grow, and what fair compensation looks like going forward.
All right, did any of our other presenters have any comments on that question? Well, if not, then I will hand it over to Jocelyn to conclude.
Excellent, thank you. I'd like to extend a final thank you to our speakers today, and of course, thank you to our attendees for participating in the webinar and for submitting questions. As a reminder, a recording of today's webinar and the presentation slides will be made available, and as Glenn mentioned, the media library with that yellow piece of paper and blue graph has the slides available right now, as well as several reports that were referenced. And this is our final webinar in the NRI Committee Spring Webinar Series. So with that, thank you for your continued interest in NCSL, and we hope all of our attendees have a great day.